What would you do if a monster knocked on your door during a snowstorm? In the brutal winter of 1987, deep in Alaska's Chugach Mountains, a grieving man named Ethan Marlowe opened his cabin door and found a massive figure slumped in the snow. A mother Bigfoot, bleeding with two trembling young by her side. They didn't growl. They didn't attack. They just looked at him with tired, pleading eyes, as if begging to survive. And Ethan, a man who had lost his wife and daughter to fire, chose to share the last of his warmth with three beings from legend. But that was only the beginning. This story, whispered for decades and documented by Alaska's forest rangers, survives only through the account of the last witness, pilot Mara Kincaid. In this short film, you'll discover why the Bigfoot mother disarmed human traps to protect her own, and Ethan, why a notorious hunter fled in fear from the very thing he came to kill, and why, in his final moments, Ethan smiled. Cradling a burned music box once belonging to his daughter, Ethan Marlowe lost everything in flames. But in one final winter, he found something no one expected: trust, warmth, and peace. If you've ever thought monsters were the enemy, this story will change that forever. Watch now, before it disappears, for unverifiable claims. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I'd love to say hi to you personally. The wind had a voice that night. Not just sound, but something behind the sound. A low, endless moan, threading through the black timber and scraping down the cabin walls like it was searching for a way in. The shutters trembled. The old latch on the front door clicked, once, twice, like fingers testing it. Ethan Marlowe sat by the fire, a hand on his knee, the other cradling a cracked ceramic mug that hadn't held anything in it for hours. The photo on the mantel, singed at one corner, leaned just a little more tonight, like even it was weary. His wife's face had long since blurred, but the outline of the child in her arms remained untouched. Untouched by flame, untouched by time. The wood groaned again, not the usual settling. This was a pressure. From outside, the door shifted in its frame. A thump, not loud, but heavy. Hit once. Ethan blinked, slow, like pulling himself up from somewhere deep, and turned his head toward the noise. He didn't rise right away. He listened. Deep breath in. Held it. Another thump. This one a scrape that trailed downward. Snow falling from a ledge? Maybe. But then he saw it. A smear. Right across the narrow window above the door. A streak that melted slowly, revealing the grain of the wood beneath. No hand he knew could have made that. Too broad. Too high. The wind surged again, rattling the walls, and Ethan stood. He grabbed the lantern, lit it with fingers that didn't shake as much as they used to, and stepped to the door. Not fast. Nothing good ever came from moving fast in a storm. The moment he cracked it open, the wind punched through the gap, slamming snow in his face. But it wasn't the wind that made him freeze. It was the shape that collapsed forward onto the porch. Huge, slumped, breathing barely. Blood, dark and sluggish, soaked into the old boards beneath the thing's shoulder. Its head hung low, fur matted with ice and mud. Snow clinging to the long tufts like the moss on trees that had never known summer. Behind it, two smaller shapes huddled. One crouched low, clutching the other. Steam curled from their backs. Eyes wide, not glowing, not monstrous, just scared. He didn't speak. No one would have heard him, not even himself. Words didn't belong here. The lantern swung in his hand, casting a low arc of light across the porch. The big one, the mother, maybe, didn't lift her head, didn't move. Just the chest, slow and uneven. The little ones didn't run. That was what struck him. They stayed close. Ethan backed up. Not far, just enough to leave room. He set the lantern down. Then he bent to push aside the stack of firewood crowding the entry and cleared the floor near the hearth with one foot. He didn't look at the photo again. He opened the door all the way and stepped back. It took a while. The first to move was the smaller of the two juveniles. Fur thinner, legs ganglier, the eyes flicking toward the fire inside like it didn't believe what it saw. Then the other, bigger one, stepped forward and touched the fallen matriarch's arm. A sound, almost like a hum, came from its throat. Brief, low, vibrating more than audible. Then, together, they leaned under her arms and slowly, awkwardly, dragged her across the threshold. Ethan didn't help. He couldn't. There were rules to this, even if he didn't know them yet. Once inside, the cabin felt smaller. The ceiling lower, the shadows stretched. The fire cracked, casting gold across the floorboards and up the walls. The younger ones stayed near her, kneeling like kids too big to be children but too soft to be anything else. One of them sniffed the air and tilted its head toward the smell of burnt pine and wool. Ethan grabbed a folded blanket from the back of the chair. Not his daughter's. That one he'd buried in a cedar box out behind the shed, years ago. This was an old army surplus, scratchy and olive drab. He laid it out near the hearth, just shy of the flames, and stepped back. She didn't stir when they laid her down. One hand, or what looked like a hand, curled loosely against her chest, the fingers impossibly long, fur-stained rust red near the knuckles. One of the juveniles pressed its forehead to her rib cage and listened. Ethan turned and walked to the stove. The kettle was cold, but he filled it anyway. His joints creaked louder than the floorboards. The cabin wasn't built for guests, and certainly not for this. As water heated, he moved without hurry, setting down a small bowl of jerky, 2 apples starting to go soft, and a tin of powdered milk he hadn't opened since fall. The smaller of the juveniles crept closer, reaching one long arm toward the heat of the fire, then pulled back fast when it got too close. The other followed, cautiously, and together they sat, knees pulled up, touching at the shoulder like saplings bent together by the wind. Ethan watched them from the stove. No sudden moves, just watching. The kettle began to hum. He filled an old ceramic basin with warm water and slid it toward the older one. She still hadn't opened her eyes, but her breathing had evened out, and every so often her brow furrowed like she was dreaming something heavy. He looked down at his hands. The scar ran the length of his forearm, pale and hard like rope pulled too tight. It never healed right. That night, the flames, the smoke. He remembered the sound of his daughter's breath more than anything. Thin, panicked, like a deer's in a trap. He stood there, basin still half full, and closed his eyes. When he opened them, one of the juveniles had crept closer, staring at his arm. It didn't touch him, just looked. So he bent down, slow, and set the basin by the mother's side, then stepped back. No words, just the crackling of the fire, the soft whistle of wind sneaking through the chinks in the logs. Later, when the flames had dimmed and the wind settled into a dull hush, Ethan dozed in his chair. The light from the fire had sunk low, just red and shadow now. One of the juveniles lay curled near the stone hearth, the other leaning against the wall. The mother stirred once in her sleep, letting out a low, pained exhale, and the youngest rose to her side, pressing a hand, large, thick-fingered but gentle, against her chest. Ethan shifted in his seat, dreamed of something he couldn't quite hold on to. Maybe a song. Maybe the way his wife used to hum while peeling potatoes. Maybe nothing at all. Then, just before the fire died entirely, one of them, he didn't know which, stood and stepped toward him. He didn't wake, didn't move. But when morning broke, casting weak winter light through the warped glass, he stirred to find a blanket pulled over his legs. Not the army surplus, one of his own. And on the floor near the hearth, 3 long, dark shapes slept. Still, breathing. Home, for now. Outside, the storm had passed, but the cold remained, and in the frost clinging to the window, a single streak trailed down the wood beside the door. Still wet, still fresh. A palm, too large for any man, too precise for a storm. Ethan didn't speak, didn't rise, just stared. Then, slowly, as if remembering how, he smiled. And somewhere between the warmth of the fire and the weight of silence, something shifted. The photograph on the mantel leaned a little straighter. The wind did not return, and for the first time in years, the cabin did not feel empty. The storm hadn't moved on. It just sank deeper into the woods like a thing with claws, curling in against the valley, stubborn and slow to let go. Snow still fell in soft sheets, quieter than the night before, but no gentler. The sky stayed black. The wind slipped through every crack in the old cabin walls, and the logs creaked like bones too long in the cold. Inside, the only sound was breath. 4 rhythms, separate and strange, trying to find some kind of peace in the same room. Ethan didn't sleep. He watched the shadows shift on the walls, eyes half-lidded, the firelight drawing low orange lines across the uneven floor. The big one, the mother, lay curled near the stove, her chest rising with slow, pained effort. One of the juveniles sat up against her shoulder, dozing with its head tucked down like a tired dog. The other sat closer to Ethan, no more than 6 feet away, legs crossed, hands on its knees, watching him. Not blinking much, just watching. He didn't move fast. That was something he'd learned out here. Slow buys you time. He reached for the pile of folded cloth on the back chair, unrolling one of the thicker wool blankets. He placed it gently on the floor between the stove and the far wall, then turned to the small cabinet where he kept spare tinware and bandages, pulled a chipped mug down, found a dented bowl, set them side by side on the stove, poured in some snowmelt from the kettle that had cooled overnight, and set them to warm again. The cabin smelled of ash, damp fur, old wood, and something new he couldn't quite place. Not unpleasant. Earthy, maybe. Like moss after a flood. The kind of smell that stuck to the inside of your nose, stayed with you even when you stepped outside. He laid out a few strips of venison jerky and a half loaf of stale sourdough on a cracked enamel tray. Then a chunk of frozen lard he chipped into small pieces and dropped into the warming water, trying to make something like a broth. The juveniles hadn't made a sound. No growls, no panting. Just the quiet rhythm of breath, in and out, like wind moving through low brush. The closer one leaned forward a little now, nose twitching at the scent of salt and fat rising from the pot. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't want to break whatever strange understanding had taken root overnight. Words felt too sharp, too heavy. Instead, he cleared a corner of the floor with his boot and laid down an old patchwork quilt, thin in spots, edges frayed. More habit than hospitality. Something to separate the world of the stove from whatever dream they'd all fallen into. The mother stirred then. Her eyes opened slowly, lids thick and heavy, and she turned her face slightly toward the heat. Not toward him, toward the warmth. Her jaw moved once, as if testing it. Then stillness again. But she was awake now. Ethan stepped back. Not far, enough to show respect. He picked up the chair he'd tipped against the wall the night before and carried it to the far side of the cabin. Turned it, sat with his back to the door. His boots left small puddles under them where the snow had melted. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, staring at the fire without looking at it. There was a moment, a long, stretching moment, when he felt them all breathe at once. All 4. Different lungs, different rhythms, but aligned for just a second. It felt like something inside the room tilted, balanced, then passed. The juveniles began to move again. One reached for the quilt, pulling a corner of it toward its mother's side, tucking it in with awkward fingers. The other, slower, dipped a hand into the bowl Ethan had set down and sniffed, then pulled back with a twitch, as if unsure of the warmth. After a beat, it dipped again, this time letting the water run through its fur. The wet hand pressed gently against the mother's side, a gesture more ritual than medical. Ethan looked down at his own hands. Burn scars across the knuckles, pale lines curling up his wrist like something drawn by heat and panic. He didn't remember the pain of it anymore, only the smoke, the way it turned everything into shadows. That night in the hills, the flames had moved faster than the wind. His wife's scream was never loud. His daughter's voice was even smaller. But he heard them both, even now. Even when the room was this quiet, he stood, not to run from it, but to move with it. Found a piece of wood, flat and wide, part of an old shelf he'd never gotten around to fixing. He laid it down on the floor, halfway between the stove and the bed. A gentle divide. Not a wall, just space. A boundary to ease the weight of silence. The juvenile watched him do it, head cocked slightly to the side, but didn't pull back. The fire snapped once, a sharp pop, then faded to its slow crackle. The mother exhaled through her nose, slow, deep, steady. The sound of pain, maybe, or simply exhaustion. He sat again. Outside, the storm hadn't lifted. Snow piled higher against the door. The small window at the back of the cabin had fogged entirely, so the light that filtered through was pale and directionless. Morning came like a whisper. Not real. Not committed. A hint of color behind the storm's teeth. Sometime after noon, if noon had any meaning here. The juveniles began to move more freely. One paced the edge of the cabin, running its long fingers over the rough logs, touching each seam, testing each corner. Not searching, learning. The other crouched by the stove, watching the fire with wide eyes. Then mimicked Ethan's movement when he fed another log into the coals. He didn't smile, but something in his chest shifted. The kettle let out a soft whine. He poured more hot water into the basin, added another chip of lard, stirred. His movements were slow, deliberate. Nothing to startle, nothing to threaten. Later, hours later, he sat near the fire, his body folded into the chair like bark into a tree. Not asleep, but close. The heat made his limbs feel heavy, and his eyes blinked slower now. The juveniles had nested beside the mother, both pressed close, one curled at her side, the other stretched across her legs. The fire threw long shapes across the walls, shadows that moved like memories. Old friends with no names. His head dropped, just a little, chin brushing his collarbone. He didn't hear the soft steps, didn't see them move. One of the juveniles rose, took the quilt with it. The fire flickered behind its shoulder. It stepped toward him, cautious but calm, bending at the knees to pull the edge of the blanket over his legs. One hand lingered a second longer than needed. A pause that wasn't confusion, just presence. Then it turned, returned to its place. He stirred, barely. A twitch in one finger, then stillness again. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees. Inside, the fire dimmed, but warmth remained. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say, just breath. In, out, human, not human, still here. Somewhere deep in the night, the mother opened her eyes again. This time, they met his. Not for long, not searching, just seen. And in that glance, fleeting as the firelight on her face, there was something older than language. Something quiet and terrible and tender. Recognition. Not of him, but of pain, of loss, of the space that opened up inside a body when the world takes more than it gives. He didn't look away. Neither did she. And when the storm finally eased its grip, when the wind curled back toward the peaks and the snow began to settle softer on the windows, Ethan sat there still, his legs covered in a blanket he hadn't pulled up himself, his head bowed just enough for the tears to fall without sound. The room hadn't changed, but everything had. The cold had changed its voice. No longer howling or biting. It now whispered through the trees like it belonged there, threading itself through the cracks in bark and ice the way water finds seams in stone. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than its noise. When Ethan stepped out that morning, shotgun slung over his shoulder, boots cutting fresh lines across the untouched snow, he looked back twice before making it to the tree line. He wasn't afraid of them. Not anymore. But something in him tightened when he thought of the cabin left behind, fire still warm, and 3 sleeping shapes that didn't belong to the world he knew. He didn't lock the door. That felt wrong, like turning your back on something that had trusted you first. He just closed it softly and let the wind do the rest. He moved quiet through the trees, the way he always had when checking traps, boots barely crunching over the crusted layer of new snow. His breath hung long in the air, breaking apart slow, like fog rising off the back of a sleeping animal. The woods were still, but not empty. He could feel them listening, not just the usual deer or the solitary fox. Something deeper, the kind of presence you don't look at directly. The kind that had watched him once through a window he hadn't cleaned in years. The line of snares he'd set near the edge of Frozen Hollow was older than most remembered. He hadn't used them much these past seasons. Less appetite, less reason. But habit ran deeper than grief. He checked them now with a kind of mechanical rhythm, eyes scanning for disturbance, fingers brushing frost from the metal. One rabbit, stiff and gray, caught clean around the leg. Nothing else, nothing big. That both comforted and unsettled him. He strung the carcass from his belt and turned back. The sky had opened just enough to let the light fall down in sheets, cold and blue. It lit the trees from beneath, made everything look suspended, like he'd walked into a world frozen mid-breath. The air smelled clean, not like pine or snow, but like nothing at all. The way it does after something important passes through. When he reached the clearing again, his heart stumbled in his chest. The door was still shut, but the window, just left of the chimney, glowed with a low flickering light. Fire still alive. Good. But there was movement. Not chaos, not destruction, just motion. Shadows stretching, a shift of something upright near the stove, and then stillness again. He opened the door slow, stepped inside, and froze. They hadn't left. They hadn't torn the place apart. They hadn't run. The matriarch sat upright now, her back braced gently against the wall beside the hearth. Her eyes were open, tracking him. No alarm, no threat, just present. Like she'd seen him coming long before he crossed the threshold. Her injuries looked different in daylight. Cleaner, not healed, but no longer desperate. Someone, something, had been tending to her. The younger ones were by the fire. One crouched with hands outstretched, palms facing the warmth, rocking slightly the way children do when they're calming themselves. The other stood by the table, massive fingers tracing the grain of the wood like it was reading it. A long smear of ash marked the wall behind them. Not a claw mark, not a warning, just a smear, as if a hand had steadied itself there during the night. Ethan stepped in fully, snow melting off his boots onto the floor. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his coat, pulled the rabbit free, and walked slowly to the counter. Laid it down without drama, without performance. He began to clean it the way his father had taught him. Blade sharp, movements quiet, respectful. He could feel their eyes on him, but not in a way that prickled. It felt more like curiosity than fear, like they were waiting to understand his version of fire. He placed the skinned meat into the cast iron pan he kept for mornings like this, added snow from the tin pail, and set it on the stove. The smell hit first. Iron, fat, old metal heating up. The little ones shifted closer, drawn by hunger or memory. The mother's eyes never moved from him, even when the steam began to rise. One of the juveniles stepped closer, the smaller one. It walked to the table and, without hesitation, placed its palm flat against the wood beside the skillet. Not pressing, just present. Ethan looked at it for the first time in full light. The hand was enormous. Fingers like small branches, the skin dark beneath the fur, pads worn like a bear's. But the gesture wasn't wild. It was deliberate, mutual, like a bridge being offered, not demanded. He nodded, once, just enough. Then turned back to the stove and ladled out a portion into the dented enamel bowl. He didn't offer it. He just set it down, stepped back, and let them choose. The juvenile approached, crouched, sniffed. Then, after a long pause, dipped its hand into the broth and brought it to its mouth. It winced slightly at the heat, then took more and more. Ethan caught the faintest sound, a hum barely audible, like the vibration of a wooden beam after pressure's released. A sound not made for him, but not hidden either. The older sibling followed. The mother remained still, but her breathing deepened. The fire caught a new log and crackled upward. That's when it hit him. They weren't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of this place. This was not shelter, not anymore. It was something else. He looked down at the table, at the handprint now drying beside his own coffee mug. It looked ancient, yet fresh. And it dawned on him, slow and heavy like snowfall at dusk. This was an agreement. No words, no boundaries. Just trust. Forged not through speech, but through firelight, food, and silence. Later, after the meal, he boiled more snow, washed the pan, and set it back on the hook. The juveniles had retreated to the corner, curled against each other, eyes half-lidded, their bellies full. The mother rested, head tilted slightly toward the window, where light now pooled in a perfect square on the floor. He stood by the counter, wiping his hands on a rag, when it happened. The mother moved, slowly, like a mountain shifting under its own weight. She pushed herself to her knees. Not with effort, but with intention. She reached one arm across the floor, pressed her open hand flat against the old pine boards, and bowed her head. Just once. It wasn't submission. It wasn't thanks in the way humans gave it. It was recognition. He didn't move. Didn't know how. She stayed like that for several breaths, then leaned back, never breaking eye contact. He felt the moment settle into him like something stitched. Not a scar. Not yet. But the beginning of one. The fire popped again. Outside, the clouds began to part, letting in that hard, unforgiving Alaskan blue. And then, in the quiet that followed, he noticed the trail. Outside the window, half buried under the snow and wind, a line of impressions curved toward the east. Not made by men, not boots, something wider, deeper, unmistakable. It ran right past the cabin, through the trees, down toward the lower ridge. A path, a passage, a story written not in ink, but in compressed snow and silence. They'd come this way before, and maybe they would again. He stood at the window for a long time after that, eyes tracing the line as far as the light would let him. Not chasing it, not fearing it, just remembering. And when he turned back, the mother was asleep once more, her children breathing slow beside her. The cabin held its breath, and for a while, no one moved. Under the brittle sunlight of late winter, the snow had hardened to a crust that cracked beneath each step. Wind no longer howled, but slipped like thread through pine needles, whispering secrets between branches stripped bare. Ethan followed the trail from his cabin slowly, eyes lowered, heartbeat steadier than it should have been. He'd risen early that morning before the light, before the others stirred. The matriarch was resting, her breath long and smooth. The two young ones had curled themselves against her sides like moss on a fallen log, warm and quiet. He hadn't needed to say anything, just stepped into his boots, pulled on the old green parka, and nodded once before pushing out into the cold. He walked along the edge of his property line, up the rise behind the shed, toward the bluff where he could see down into the trees below. That's where he saw it first. Not a track, not a twig out of place, but a glint, metal, sharp, unnatural. Too clean for this part of the forest. He crouched slowly, hand out, brushing snow from the curve of a steel jaw. A foothold trap. Fresh, oiled, baited, set for something big. The steel teeth were old, but the chain was new. Ethan stood without a word, staring down at the frozen ground. Something turned in his gut. He followed the line of disturbed snow, a curve of prints. Wide boots, deep treads. Not his. Not recent neighbors either. He knew what this was before he saw the second trap, then the third. One hung from a pine, jaws already stained faint red with a smear of something caught and pulled free. Not rabbit, not fox, bigger. Clumps of dark hair, coarse like bark, were frozen to the hinge. He didn't need to touch it to know. That's when he heard the engine. Low, distant, echoing off the ridge like a memory. He turned toward the sound just as a flash of silver cut across the sky. Mara's plane. The small bushcraft skimming low, dipping its wings once before beginning its slow arc toward the frozen lake. She always brought supplies this time of year. Some sugar, maybe flour. And gossip, always gossip. He headed back toward the cabin with faster steps, following a different trail through the dense trees. Snow sloughed off the higher branches, falling in soft clumps, muffling sound. When he crested the hill that looked over the lake, she was already down, the plane skid slicing clean across the flat white surface. She stood outside the cockpit, scarf wrapped up to her nose, waving once before turning to drag a crate out of the cargo hold. He waved back, but his hand didn't stay up long. By the time he reached the edge of the lake, she was sitting on the crate, flask in one hand, smirk on her lips. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, her hair tucked up beneath a wool cap too big for her head. She handed him the flask without asking. He took a sip. It burned. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said, eyeing him from under her lashes. "Or maybe just smelled Glenn Harper." The name landed like a stone dropped into black water. He handed the flask back. "What's he doing up here?" "Bragging, mostly," she muttered. "Caught up with him last week when I dropped off fuel near Eagle Pass. Said he's got something in the woods he's been tracking for weeks now. Called it the Mountain Ghost. Said he saw it near your old fire line." Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Mara shrugged, leaning forward to pick at the twine wrapped around the crate. "You ask me. He's drunk and half crazy, but the kind of crazy that still remembers where to put a trap. Said it moved like a bear, but with eyes that followed you like a man." He didn't flinch, didn't look up. Just stared past her, toward the tree line. "He still carries that old burn on his conscience?" she asked softly, almost joking. Then she saw his face. "Sorry," she said quickly. "Didn't mean—" He raised a hand. "It's fine." She hesitated, then pulled something from her jacket pocket. A folded map, edges soft from handling. "He left this behind. Might have been on purpose, might have been accident. Either way, I figured if anyone could read it, it's you." Ethan took it with a nod, unfolding it slowly. It was an old topographical survey, marked in ink that had bled slightly from moisture. But what caught his eye wasn't the map itself. It was the small scrawl at the corner of a ridgeline, the initials GH, and a note in shorthand. "Burn line here. Wind shift wrong. Regret." His breath caught. He folded the map once, then again, sliding it into his coat pocket. "He's not just hunting," he said quietly. "He's looking to prove something." Mara studied him for a moment, her eyes sharper now. "You thinking about stopping him?" He didn't answer, not directly. He picked up the crate. "Thanks for this." She tilted her head. "You okay, Ethan?" He nodded, but his eyes said no. He turned back toward the trees. The weight of the box in his arms didn't feel heavy, but the air behind him suddenly did. By the time he reached the cabin, the light was changing again. That pale gold slant of afternoon where the sun started dropping faster than expected. The fire inside had kept low but alive. He stepped through the door quietly, set the crate down beside the cupboard, and looked up. She was already there, the matriarch, standing just outside the door. Not inside, not hiding. Her figure filled the entrance, casting a long, broad shadow across the cabin floor. Behind her, the wind had stilled. The snow no longer fell. She didn't growl, didn't make a sound. But her eyes met his, and held. He stepped forward, slowly, letting his breath ease. The map still heavy in his pocket. She turned her head slightly, nostrils flaring as if she smelled the ink, the paper, the fire behind him. Her gaze lowered briefly to the spot on his coat where the map lay, then rose again, and something passed between them. Not fear, not gratitude, something older. He didn't speak, just stepped to the side, letting her pass. She moved with care, ducking beneath the low beam, her injured shoulders stiff but no longer trembling. Her children were asleep by the hearth. She moved to them, sat down slow, her wide back curling around them like a wall of breathing stone. Ethan stood at the door for a long time, hand still resting against the frame. Outside, the trail of Glenn Harper's traps stretched somewhere through the woods. Inside, trust now stood on both sides of the threshold, and the distance between them narrowed. The knock came just past sundown. Not loud, not frantic. Just 3 deliberate raps against the cabin door like someone asking a question they already knew the answer to. The fire inside had settled into its rhythm, casting shadows low and long across the floor. Ethan froze where he stood, a kettle in one hand, steam rising slow into the hush. The air in the room changed. It thickened. Behind him, the matriarch shifted, her shoulders lifting faintly like a mountain inhaling. The juveniles stilled, eyes wide in the firelight, but silent. No growls, no movement. Just the sound of the wind retreating into the eaves and those 3 knocks still echoing in the wood. He set the kettle down, slow, careful not to let the handle clang. Crossed the room, without a word. His boots brushed the old quilt on the floor, the one they'd all started to share without discussing it. He stopped a foot from the door. That silence, thick, heavy, settled on his shoulders again like wet snow. He reached out, fingers brushing the edge of the latch, and pulled the door open just enough to see a face he hadn't seen in 15 years. Glenn Harper, same beard, same worn-out ranger coat, though it hung looser now, faded along the sleeves. But the eyes, those were different, harder, sunken in, like they'd been staring too long at something no one else could see. A thin smile curled at his mouth, but it didn't touch anything behind it. "Evening, Ethan," Glenn said softly, like they were just neighbors catching up. "Mind if I come in?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He glanced back, just a flick of the eyes, toward the darkened side of the cabin where the mother and her young had gathered. Then back to the man on the porch. "What are you doing here?" Ethan said, not a question. Glenn shifted his weight, boots creaking on the wood. "Heard rumor you'd gone soft. Let something in that ought to be 6 feet under. Figured I'd see for myself." Ethan didn't move. Not yet. His grip on the door stayed steady, but the blood in his hand had gone cold. Glenn leaned closer, just an inch. "You hiding them in here?" he whispered like it was a joke between old friends. "Tell me you're not that gone." Ethan stepped out, closed the door behind him with a click. The cold caught him fast, but he didn't flinch. His eyes held Glenn steady. "You got no business here?" Glenn chuckled, dry and low. "I got every business here. They're dangerous. You remember what happened in '72? The old Hensley boy, torn open like kindling. And don't give me that nature's sacred stuff. That thing in there ain't nature. It's a ghost walking in fur." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That was no accident. You lit a fire you couldn't control." Glenn's smile vanished. The wind shifted then. Just a flick. enough to swing the lantern hanging above the porch, casting both men into a sudden half-shadow. Glenn's hand drifted down toward the shape under his coat. Ethan's didn't move, but his breath came slower now. Behind the door, wood creaked, not from the frame, from weight, from movement. A shadow rose against the frosted window pane, and then the door eased open, just a little. Enough. She stood there, the matriarch, backlit by the fire, her form towering in the cabin's threshold. No growl, no roar, no threat in her posture, but presence, heavy as the mountain. Eyes fixed on Glenn. He didn't speak, didn't blink, just stared, and in that moment, every lie he'd ever told himself about what he hunted seemed to crumble. Ethan stepped between them. Leave. Glenn didn't move. Not for a long time. Then he exhaled, a long breath that hung in the air like smoke from something dying. "You don't get it," he said. "You never did. Things like that, they don't belong in our world." Ethan said nothing, just stared. Glenn's hand twitched again toward his coat. But before it cleared the flap, there was movement. Fast. Not loud. The matriarch didn't lunge. She didn't growl. She just stepped forward, past Ethan, past the door, into the porch light. Her head lowered slightly, eyes locked on Glenn's hand. A quiet sound, low, resonant, rose from her chest. Not warning, not anger, just tired. Glenn froze. Then, from beneath the snow, out near the woodpile, a loud, metallic clack snapped the air. Glenn flinched, then silence. Ethan turned his head. He knew that sound, knew it too well. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching. Glenn followed, slower, more rigid. They both moved toward the trap set 2 days prior, now triggered but empty. The snow around it disturbed, melted slightly, revealing a shape, a wide handprint pressed into the frost. Not human. 5 thick fingers, a palm larger than any man's. And beside it, the trap's trigger had been tripped not by a foot, not by force, but by design. The pin removed, the catch disarmed, the trap neutralized. Ethan looked up. Glenn's face had drained of its color. "She did that," Ethan said quietly. "She protected her own." Glenn opened his mouth, but nothing came. Just the rattle of breath. He stepped back, then another step. "I won't say it again," Ethan murmured. "Leave this place." Glenn stared at the handprint one last time, then at the matriarch standing silent behind them. No rage, no triumph, just presence. Watching. He turned without a word and walked into the trees. The cold swallowed him fast. Ethan stood alone for a moment. Just him and the snow and the faint sound of wind climbing through the pines. Then the matriarch stepped past him, moving without sound back toward the cabin. Her shoulders heavy, her head low. Not from fear, from something else. He followed. Inside, the juveniles had not moved. Still curled, still breathing slow. The fire cracked once as he shut the door behind him. Neither of them spoke. There was no need. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft, relentless, quiet. Inside, the air felt warmer than it had in years. And somewhere beneath the boards, the ghost of an old fire still smoldered. Not one made of flame, but of memory, of pain, of choices that had never been undone. The kettle hissed on the stove, forgotten. Ethan sat. The matriarch lowered herself near the fire, her eyes never leaving the door. And in the stillness that followed, the sound of Glenn's retreat became just another echo in the trees. The aurora came that night like a soft breath exhaled over the roof, not in wild ribbons, but in slow drifts of green and violet, slipping across the sky like they were afraid to touch the earth. It coated the snow in a hush that shimmered at the edges of vision, quieting the world in a way no storm ever could. Ethan sat near the hearth, his left arm bent awkwardly at his side, a strip of flannel pressed to the gash just below the elbow. Blood had soaked through in a thick blotch, dark and spreading. He hadn't said anything. Not when it happened, not after. Pain was something he'd learned to let sit beside him, like a familiar guest too stubborn to leave. The room was dim, firelight low, shadows deep. One of the juveniles had gone still in the corner, curled up near the crates. The other sat wide-eyed near the wall, knees tucked to its chest, watching him, not afraid, but alert. The matriarch stood across from him, her gaze heavy, her breathing quiet but steady. She didn't approach at first, just studied the way he moved, the way his shoulders stiffened each time he adjusted, the way his jaw tensed when the cloth slipped loose. He didn't notice her move, only realized she was beside him when her shadow passed over the blood-stained rag. She knelt without a sound. The floor creaked once beneath her weight. She didn't reach for him, not right away. She looked at the wound, not with alarm, not like an animal drawn to scent, but like someone trying to understand what had broken. He didn't pull away. She leaned down, gathered a pinch of snow from the edge of the doorframe where cold still drifted in, held it in one palm. Her other hand reached into the satchel she had carried, slung across her chest, woven from bark strips and coated in moss. She pulled out something green, damp, fibrous, reindeer moss maybe, or something like it. She pressed the snow to it, turned it once, and then, with the most careful motion Ethan had seen since his daughter used to brush dust off her glass marbles, she pressed it gently to the wound. It stung, then numbed. He didn't make a sound. She held it there a long time, just breathing, watching the skin beneath twitch and settle. Then she looked up, not into his eyes, but toward the shelf above the hearth, the metal tin, the one he hadn't touched in years. He followed her gaze, slow, uncertain, then rose, reached up with his good arm, and brought it down. Inside, wrapped in a scarf so old the threads frayed at his touch, was a small, wooden box. Pale maple, slightly scorched along one edge from the same fire that had taken everything else. He unwrapped it, set it down gently between them, and opened the lid. The sound was fragile, a tune barely there, half a lullaby, half a memory. The gears inside the box clicked softly, almost too quiet to follow, but the notes floated through the room like dust in sunlight. Simple, worn, familiar. He hadn't heard it in 10 years, not since the night before they left the fire line. His daughter had cranked the key herself, watched it spin, then closed the lid just before the second chorus. Now it sang again. The juvenile stirred. The smaller one sat up. The other crept closer, drawn by something they couldn't name. The matriarch tilted her head, the same way deer do when they hear wind before it turns to thunder. And then, something shifted in her. She hummed. It wasn't melody. Not exactly. It was low, round, resonant. More vibration than song, but it matched the notes, sliding beneath them like roots beneath a river. The music box played its fragile tune, and she, ancient, scarred, immense, answered it. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. His chest felt hollow, like all the air had gone somewhere else. The young ones leaned into the sound, eyes wide, unmoving. Their bodies, all fur and breath and bone, slowed to the rhythm of it. One pressed its palm to the floor like it could feel the tune running through the earth. The fire didn't crackle, the wind didn't stir, just the music and her voice and the memory of a time when things hadn't yet broken. Ethan looked at her, really looked, at the scars around her eyes, the old wound in her side, the tenderness in her fingers, the grief she carried, quiet, without complaint, and it hit him like a wave swallowing the coast. She'd lost something too. He didn't know what. Didn't have to. He turned his head, pressed the back of his hand to his face, and let the tears come without apology. Not loud, not shaking, just wet and sudden, and long overdue. The music box kept turning. The matriarch kept humming. And for a moment, Just a moment, he wasn't alone in his sorrow. He let the tune finish, let the box wind down, let the silence return. Then, slowly, she pushed the box toward him. Not away, not back, toward him. He understood. Keep it, remember it, but not just as a relic, as a thread, as a bridge. He nodded once, not a big motion, just enough. She stood. The young ones rose with her, quiet as snowfall. The fire caught again, throwing orange light across the beams. Ethan sat there, his arm wrapped in moss and cloth, the box warm in his lap, the air still humming with something too old to name. They didn't speak. They never had. But something between them had shifted. Not everything mended. Not yet. But something old had moved. Something sealed had cracked, just enough for air to get in. Outside, the aurora rolled slow over the pines. Inside, the room felt less like a cabin and more like a place where old things were allowed to breathe. He looked down at the music box again, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was holding the past. He felt like it was holding him. The thaw didn't announce itself. It crept in quiet, not with warmth, but with motion. Ice no longer cracked in protest, but sighed beneath its own weight. Along the creek below the bluff, water began to whisper again, dark veins cutting through the white like roots, searching for spring. The sky stayed dull, but the air carried something different. The kind of scent that lived just beneath the snow, damp earth, pine sap, the first hint of rot waking up from the freeze. Ethan stood on the porch with his hands tucked under his arms, chin dipped into the collar of his coat. The wind touched his face but didn't bite anymore. He could feel it shifting, that strange stillness before change, that moment when a season lets go, even if it doesn't want to. The cabin behind him was silent. Not empty, just quiet. A quiet earned. He hadn't seen them since the night before. No footsteps on the floorboards, no creaks on the rafters. Just warmth left behind, and the memory of breath. He hadn't asked questions. Some things didn't need them, but his boots were still near the hearth, and his coat had been moved a few inches to the left. The blanket on the chair had been folded, and the fire, though down to coals, still glowed steady when he woke. Now the sky was soft gray, low and indifferent. He scanned the yard, eyes catching the tracks where they used to sleep under the overhang. Gone. No prints past the edge of the woods, just a clean curve in the snow near the back, pressed down once like a knee had knelt there. He stepped out, walked around the side. That's when he saw it. On the steps, just beneath the porch rail, she had left a bundle, small, dry, wrapped in a twist of woven grass and fine bark. He crouched, breath clouding before him, and touched it gently. Fireweed, dried, purple blossoms curled and crumbling, bound with a strip of foxtail. Carefully arranged, carefully placed. Not for utility, for meaning. His fingers tightened around it. He didn't smile. Not yet. He walked inside, set the bundle down on the counter like it was something sacred. And maybe it was. He didn't sit. Not right away. He moved slow, unsure of what he was looking for. The cabin felt bigger without them, but not emptier. Like a story after the last sentence. Done, but still echoing. Then he opened the door again, and they were gone. Really gone. He stood there for a while, longer than he should have, watching nothing. Listening for the soft pad of feet, the rustle of branch, the low hum that had once filled the space between breaths. But the woods didn't answer. Eventually, he stepped off the porch. He didn't call out, didn't try to follow. There was nothing to chase. He walked to the edge of the trees. The snow was thinner here, patchy. His boots sank, then held. And ahead, fading toward the slope, tracks. Big ones. 3 sets, one wider than the others, slow and deliberate. One lighter, faster, circling back often, and one long straight, stepping between the others like a shadow. They moved together, not fleeing, not hiding, just going. He watched until the wind brushed the snow again and the trail began to blur. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open slightly on its own. He didn't look back. He stood there until the cold found his knees. Then he turned and walked back home. Mara flew in the next afternoon, her plane skating low across the half-frozen lake. From the bluff, Ethan watched her cut the engine and coast, the silence swallowing the last hum of the propeller. When she climbed out, her boots sank deep into the melting crust. She raised a hand. He waved back, but his face didn't carry the usual lines. They met near the tree line. She carried nothing this time, just questions behind her eyes. He didn't give answers, not yet. She kicked at the snow with her heel. "Saw Glenn." That pulled his gaze up. She nodded, jaw tight. He was dragging something. Looked like a broken leg. His face. She shook her head. He looked like he'd been staring at God too long. Ethan waited. "He said you were right," she added, quieter now. "Said they weren't monsters. Said they just wanted to live." He nodded once, just enough. She didn't ask what he'd done to convince him. He didn't say. She followed him back toward the cabin, boots crunching soft behind him. Smoke curled from the chimney now, thin and steady. Inside, the fire was fresh. The bundle of fireweed sat on the mantel, the foxtail still tied tight. Mara stopped in the doorway. "You get visitors?" Ethan looked down at the floor, then up at the frame above the door. There, pressed faintly into the wood, still damp, was a handprint. Larger than any man's, broader than memory, just the outline. Still warm. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. She stepped in after him, slower now. He moved to the stove. Poured coffee without asking. She took the mug, but her eyes stayed on the fireweed. She looked like she might say something, but didn't. Instead, they sat. The wind outside grew softer. The light slanted down through the windows, catching the wood just right, making dust dance in slow spirals above the table. Mara leaned back. "So that's it then?" He shook his head. "No, not it. Not quite." Out the window, toward the tree line, something shifted in the light. Not movement, not a figure, just the feeling that someone had paused and looked back. He rose and stepped outside again, boots thudding softly on the porch. The snow was melting now. Water pooled in the yard in shallow reflections, catching sky and shadow both. He looked to the woods, and in the distance, so faint it could have been a trick of the sun, 3 shapes stood at the edge of the tree line. Tall, still, watching, no movement, no sound, just a shared silence that stretched from one world into another. He raised his hand, didn't wave, just held it there, like a door left open. Then the wind turned, and when he looked again, they were gone. By the time the last fireweed bloomed, the mountains had softened. Where snow once sealed the ridges like glass, now green pushed up through the thaw with a hunger older than memory. The pines held their breath, branches heavy with new needles, while the moss below drank everything the rain forgot. It was the season the locals called green-up, when Alaska shed its winter like a thick skin, and every ridge, every trail, every creek pulsed with the rhythm of life coming back. That morning, the ranger team arrived in a pair of trucks that groaned under the gravel, tires popping stones as they climbed toward the clearing near Frozen Hollow. The sky was overcast. A pale sheet stretched low over the peaks, but the wind was kind, and the forest quiet in the way it only is when it's listening. Mara rode up front, beside the district chief, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. She hadn't said much the whole drive. Didn't need to. She already knew what they'd find, or what they wouldn't. The truck stopped just before the tree line. The younger rangers stepped out slow, boots sinking into soft earth thick with fern roots and needles. It smelled of cedar and iron and something else, faint, like memory. Mara stayed in the cab for another few breaths, then opened the door. The cabin stood just ahead, same as always. Roof patched with old tin and moss, porch sagging at the corners, smoke-black stains above the chimney. But something was different. Not broken, not wrong, just Still. She walked up the steps, hand brushing the railing where the wood splintered out like a half-formed scar. The door was shut, but not latched. She pushed it open with the side of her hand. The air inside was warm, not from fire, from presence. There was no mess. No signs of struggle. No overturned chairs. No broken glass. Just the hush of time having stopped somewhere between one breath and the next. On the table sat a half-empty cup, dust settling on the rim. A folded cloth on the back of the rocker. A pair of boots by the door, the laces tucked in neat. And in the cot by the far wall, Ethan lay still, blanket drawn up just below his chest, hands resting over a small wooden box. His face was peaceful, eyes closed, no pain, just sleep, but deeper, final. Mara didn't speak. She didn't have to. The chief stepped in behind her, paused, then motioned for the younger rangers to hold back. One of them asked, too softly, if there were signs of struggle. The chief shook his head. No, none. Man died in his sleep. Mara took a step closer. Not too close. Just enough to see that the box between his hands was the same one she remembered from the old stories. The one he'd told her about once when they were younger, before the fire took his family. A music box. The lid was open, barely. The crank still extended, as if it had just played. Or was waiting to be played again. She swallowed hard. Her gaze shifted to the door frame. And there, just beside the latch, faint and still wet with morning dew, was a handprint. Too large for any man, pressed flat, deliberate, still warm. She turned back to Ethan's body, the way his mouth held the trace of a smile, like he'd seen something before he left. Something that settled him, something that brought him home. Near the hearth, on the small mantel where he once kept his coffee tin and a broken compass, was a bundle, fresh fireweed. This time still wet from the field, blossoms bright pink, bound again with foxtail, the stems glistening with mist like someone had placed it there just moments before. No one spoke for a long time. The wind moved across the porch. A jay called once, then fell quiet. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the lake cracked once under its own weight. Spring reminding the world it had come back again, whether anyone was ready or not. Mara walked to the window, stared out. The grass had grown thick in the yard. The snow was gone. But in the shadow of the trees, at the edge of the clearing, 3 shapes stood. Not close, not threatening, just present, tall, immense, still. They didn't move, didn't step forward, just stood in silence, watching the cabin. The younger rangers followed her gaze, some blinking like they didn't believe what they saw. One reached for the camera on their vest, but the chief stopped them. "Let them be," he said. Mara nodded. Her hands rested on the window frame, fingers cold against the glass. She didn't know if it was a farewell, or a memory made visible, but she knew it meant something. The fire in the stove had long gone cold, but the scent of cedar still hung in the air. And beneath that, faint but real, something else lingered. Music. Not loud, not even full. Just a note, maybe 2. Like the last wind of a melody turning in the dark. She stepped outside. The grass bent beneath her boots, wet and soft. The figures hadn't moved, but she didn't expect them to. She walked to the porch and stopped, reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small stone, flat, warm from her hand. She placed it gently on the rail, then turned. The rangers behind her didn't ask anything else. They knew better now. She said his name once, low, then turned toward the truck. Inside, on the nightstand, the music box clicked once, then went still. Out in the woods, the 3 figures finally stepped back. Not away, just back. The forest took them in like it always had, like it always would. And the wind carried nothing but green. There are some stories we don't tell to be remembered. We tell them so we don't forget. Not just the events, but the quiet moments in between. The hush of a room after the fire dies down. The press of a hand against weathered wood. The feeling of being seen by something older than language. Stories like this don't ask for explanations. They don't promise easy answers. They simply ask us to listen with more than our ears. Because somewhere in the space between fear and understanding, between loss and grace, something sacred still breathes. Something wild, yes, but not cruel. Something ancient, but not gone. And if we're willing to sit with the silence long enough to let go of the noise and the need to conquer everything we don't recognize, we might just find that the most powerful kind of connection isn't loud or sudden. It's gentle, it's earned, it's silent and slow, and full of meaning. In a world that often moves too fast, where everything is tracked, measured, and named, there's still room for mystery, for reverence, for the kind of presence that changes us, not by force, but by reminding us who we used to be and who we could be again. Sometimes compassion is the most defiant act. Sometimes mercy echoes farther than justice ever could. And sometimes the deepest truths are passed between those who never speak at all. We share stories like this not to tame the unknown, but to make peace with it, to learn that not every shadow is danger, not every silence is emptiness, and not every goodbye means the end. Thank you for spending time with this journey. If it touched something quiet in you, some place that still believes in grace, in wonder, in second chances, feel free to share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear what stayed with you. And if you'd like more stories like this, where the wild is not the enemy, and where hearts can still find each other in the dark, make sure to like, follow, and subscribe to stay connected. We'll be waiting right here when you're ready to listen again.